Hey guys, I'm here with part 2 of Personhood and Being, From Mask to Person, The Birth of an Ontology of Personhood. And unfortunately, I am just stumbling over my words a lot tonight. So what I'm going to do is just keep barreling through. I've tried stopping and restarting several times, and it's just what it is, that my mouth is doing its own thing, and I will get through it, and I'm sorry for any difficulties. Number 2. The concept of the person, with its absolute and ontological content, was born historically from the endeavor of the Church to give ontological expression to its faith in the triune God. This faith was primitive. It goes back to the very first years of the Church and was handed down from generation to generation with the practice of baptism. The constant and profound contact, however, between Christianity and Greek philosophy sharpened the problem of the interpretation of this faith in a manner which would satisfy Greek thought. What does it mean to say that God is Father, Son, and Spirit without ceasing to be the one God? The history of the disputes which broke out on this great theme do not interest us here in detail. What is significant is that this history includes a philosophical landmark, a revolution in Greek philosophy. This revolution is expressed historically through an identification, the identification of the hypostasis with the person. How was this unforeseen revolution accomplished? What kind of consequences did it have for the concept of the person? These are the questions which must occupy us briefly. The term hypostasis never had any connection with the term person in Greek philosophy. As we've seen, person would have been regarded by the Greeks as expressive of anything but the essence of man, whereas the term hypostasis was already closely linked with the term substance, and finally was identified fully with it. It's precisely this identification of substance with hypostasis, diffused so widely in the Greek thought of the first Christian centuries, that created all the difficulties and disputes concerning the Holy Trinity in the 4th century. It's relevant to our theme that the term person, which had already been used in the West from the time of Tertullian for the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, una substantia tre personae, did not meet with acceptance in the East precisely because the term person lacked an ontological content and led towards Sabellianism, the manifestation of God in 3 roles. That's how foreign the term person was to ontology. Instead of this term, the East was already in the time of Origen using the term hypostases for the Holy Trinity. But this term also had its dangers. It could have been interpreted in a Neoplatonic fashion. Plotinus already speaks of the hypostases of the divine, with all the dangers which a union of God and the world in the Neoplatonic manner would have held for Christian theology. Moreover, it could have been interpreted tritheistically if the then current identification of hypostasis with substance had been taken into consideration. A mode of expression thus had to be found which would give theology the ability to avoid Sabellianism, that is, which would give an ontological content to each person of the Holy Trinity, without endangering its biblical principles, monotheism, and the absolute ontological independence of God in relation to the world. From this endeavor came the identification of hypostasis with person. The historical aspect of this development is very obscure and does not interest us here directly. I believe myself that the key to this development must be sought in the Western Greek writer Hippolytus, who's perhaps the first to use the Greek term prosopon, in imitation of Tertullian, in Trinitarian theology. It would be of historical interest to investigate the nuances of the term hypostasis, which occasioned its divergence from the term substance. However, none of this can explain the momentous step of the identification of hypostasis with the term person without an examination of the broader philosophical changes which were effected in the patristic age in relation to Greek thought. The deeper significance of the identification of hypostasis with person, a significance the revolutionary nature of which, in the development of Greek thought, seems to have escaped the attention of the history of philosophy, consists in a twofold thesis. A. The person is no longer an adjunct to a being, a category which we add to a concrete entity once we've first verified its ontological hypostasis. It is itself the hypostasis of the being. B. Entities no longer trace their being to being itself. That is, being is not an absolute category in itself, but to the person, to precisely that which constitutes being, that is, enables entities to be entities. In other words, from an adjunct to a being, a kind of mask, the person becomes the being itself and is simultaneously a most significant point, the constitutive element, the principle or cause of beings. For Greek thought to have arrived at such a radical reappraisal of its ontology, two basic leavenings had previously taken place in the field of patristic theology. The first concerns that which I've just named the ontological absoluteness of cosmological necessity. In accordance with biblical theology, of which the fathers cannot have been ignorant, the world is not ontologically necessary. Although the ancient Greeks assumed with regard to the ontology of the world that it was something necessary of itself, the biblical doctrine of creation ex nihilo obliged the fathers to introduce a radical difference into ontology, to trace the world back to an ontology outside the world, that is, to God. They thus broke the circle of the closed ontology of the Greeks, and at the same time did something much more important, which is of direct interest to us here. They made being, the existence of the world, existent things, a product of freedom. That is how the first leavening was accomplished, with the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, the principle of Greek ontology. The arche of the world was transposed to the sphere of freedom. That which exists was liberated from itself. The being of the world became free from necessity. But there was also a second leavening, which led to an even further reappraisal of Greek ontology. Not only was the being of the world traced back to personal freedom, but the being of God himself was identified with the person. This leavening was effected through the disputes on the Holy Trinity, mainly through the theology of the Cappadocian Fathers, and above all by St. Basil. This theology does not concern us here except for one basic point, which, unfortunately, is often overlooked. As is known, the final formulation of the doctrine of the Holy Trinity speaks of one substance, three persons. Mia ousia, tria prosopa. One would therefore have said that the unity of God, the ontology of God, consists in the substance of God. This would bring us back to the ancient Greek ontology. God first is God, his substance or nature, his being, and then exists as Trinity. That is, as persons. This interpretation, in fact, prevailed in Western theology and, unfortunately, entered into modern Orthodox dogmatics with the arrangement in the dogmatic handbooks of the headings On the One God, followed by On the Trinity. The significance of this interpretation lies in the assumption that the ontological principle of God is not found in the person, but in the substance. That is, in the being itself of God. Indeed, the idea took shape in Western theology that which constitutes the unity of God is the one divine substance, the one divinity. That is, as it were, the ontological principle of God. But this interpretation represents a misrepresentation of the patristic theology of the Trinity. Among the Greek fathers, the unity of God, the one God, and the ontological principle or cause of the being and life of God does not consist in the one substance of God, but in the hypostasis, that is, the person of the Father. The one God is not the one substance, but the Father, who is the cause both of the generation of the Son and of the procession of the Spirit. Consequently, the ontological principle of God is traced back once again to the person. Thus, when we say that God is, we do not bind the personal freedom of God. The being of God is not an ontological necessity or a simple reality for God, but we ascribe the being of God to his personal freedom. In a more analytical way, this means that God, as Father and not as substance, perpetually confirms through being his free will to exist. And it is precisely his Trinitarian existence that constitutes this confirmation. The Father, out of love, that is freely, begets the Son and brings forth the Spirit. If God exists, he exists because the Father exists. That is, he who out of love freely begets the Son and brings forth the Spirit. Thus, God as person, as the hypostasis of the Father, makes the one divine substance to be that which it is, the one God. This point is absolutely crucial, for it's precisely with this point that the new philosophical position of the Cappadocian Fathers, and of St. Basil in particular, is directly connected. That is to say, the substance never exists in a naked state, that is, without hypostasis, without a mode of existence. And the one divine substance is consequently the being of God, only because it has these three modes of existence, which it owes not to the substance, but to the one person, the Father. Outside the Trinity, there is no God. That is, no divine substance, because the ontological principle of God is the Father. The personal existence of God, the Father, constitutes his substance, makes it hypostases. The being of God is identified with the person. Number 3. What therefore is important in Trinitarian theology is that God exists on account of a person, the Father, and not on account of a substance. Because its significance is not simply theoretical or academic, but profoundly existential, let us attempt a brief analysis of it. A. The ultimate challenge to the freedom of the person is the necessity of existence. The moral sense of freedom to which Western philosophy has accustomed us is satisfied with the simple power of choice. A man is free who's able to choose one of the possibilities set before him. But this freedom is already bound by the necessity of these possibilities. And the ultimate and most binding of these necessities for man is his existence itself. How can a man be considered absolutely free when he cannot do other than accept his existence? Dostoevsky poses this great problem in a startling manner in The Possessed. There, Kirillov says, "Every man who desires to attain total freedom must be bold enough to put an end to his life. This is the ultimate limit of freedom. This is all. There is nothing beyond this. Whoever dares to commit suicide becomes God. Everyone can do this and so bring the existence of God to an end. And then there will be absolutely nothing." These words of Kirillov express the most tragic side of the person's quest, the transcendence of the necessity of existence, the possibility of affirming his existence not as a recognition of a given fact, of a reality, but as the product of his free consent and self-affirmation. This, and nothing less, is what man seeks in being a person. But in man's case, this quest comes into conflict with his createdness. As a creature, he cannot escape the necessity of his existence. The person, consequently, cannot be realized as an intramundal or fully human reality. Philosophy can arrive at the confirmation of the reality of the person, but only theology can treat of the genuine, the authentic person, because the authentic person, an absolute ontological freedom, must be uncreated, that is, unbounded by any necessity, including its own existence. If such a person does not exist in reality, the concept of the person is a presumptuous daydream. If God does not exist, the person does not exist. B. But what is this freedom of self-affirmation, of existence? How is it expressed? How is it realized? The disturbing words which Dostoevsky puts in Kirillov's mouth sound an alarm. If the only way of exercising absolute ontological freedom for man is suicide, then freedom leads to nihilism. The person is shown to be the negator of ontology. This existential alarm, the fear of nihilism, is so serious that in the last analysis it must itself be regarded as responsible for the relativization of the concept of the person. Indeed, every claim to absolute freedom is always countered by the argument that its realization would lead to chaos. The concept of law, as much in its ethical as in its juridical sense, always presupposes some limitation to personal freedom in the name of order and harmony, the need for symbiosis with others. Thus, the other becomes a threat to the person. It's hell and its fall, to recall the words of Sartre. Once again, the concept of the person leads human existence to an impasse. Humanism proves unable to affirm personhood. At this point, theology, literally speech or thought about God, unavoidably intervenes. Yet again, if the concept of the person is to receive a positive content. But to repeat once more, only a correct orte theology, as formulated by the Greek fathers, can give the answer. Orthodoxy here is not an optimal extra for human existence. How does God affirm his ontological freedom? I've said earlier that man cannot exercise his ontological freedom absolutely, because he's tied by his createdness, by the necessity of his existence, whereas God, as uncreated, does not experience this limitation. If the ground of God's ontological freedom lies simply in his nature, that is, in his being uncreated by nature, whereas we are by nature created, then there's no hope, no possibility that man might become a person in the sense that God is one, that is, an authentic person. But no, the ground of God's ontological freedom lies not in his nature, but in his personal existence. That is, in the mode of existence by which he subsists as divine nature. And it's precisely this that gives man, in spite of his different nature, his hope of becoming an authentic person. The manner in which God exercises his ontological freedom, that precisely which makes him ontologically free, is the way in which he transcends and abolishes the ontological necessity of the substance by being God as Father. That is, as he who begets the Son and brings forth the Spirit. This ecstatic character of God, the fact that his being is identical with an act of communion, ensures the transcendence of the ontological necessity which his substance would have demanded, if the substance were the primary ontological predicate of God, and replaces this necessity with the free self-affirmation of divine existence. For this communion is a product of freedom, as a result not of the substance of God, but of a person, the Father. Observe why this doctrinal detail is so important. Who is Trinity, not because the divine nature is ecstatic, but because the Father as a person freely wills this communion. It thus becomes evident that the only exercise of freedom in an ontological manner is love. The expression God is love, 1 John 4:16, signifies that God subsists as Trinity, that is, as person, and not as substance. Love is not an emanation or a property of the substance of God. This detail is significant in light of what I've said so far, but is constitutive of his substance, i.e., it's that which makes God what he is, the one God. Thus, love ceases to be a qualifying, i.e., secondary property of being, and becomes the supreme ontological predicate. Love, as God's mode of existence hypostasizes God, constitutes his being. Therefore, as a result of love, the ontology of God is not subject to the necessity of the substance. Love is identified with ontological freedom. All this means that personhood creates for human existence the following dilemma: either freedom as love or freedom as negation. The choice of the latter certainly constitutes an expression of personhood. Only the person can seek negative freedom, but it's a negation nevertheless of its ontological content. For nothing has no ontological content when the person is seen in the light of Trinitarian theology. C. The person does not simply want to be, to exist eternally, that is, to possess an ontological content. It wants something more, to exist as a concrete, unique, and unrepeatable entity. The person cannot be understood simply as the ecstasy of the substance. It must necessarily be regarded also as the hypostasis of the substance, as a concrete and unique identity. Uniqueness is something absolute for the person. The person is so absolute in its uniqueness that it does not permit itself to be regarded as an arithmetical concept, to be set alongside other beings, to be combined with other objects, or to be used as a means, even for the most sacred goal. The goal is the person itself. Personhood is the total fulfillment of being, the Catholic expression of its nature. This tendency of the person, like freedom, is a two-edged sword of existence. For applied to man, it leads to the denial of others, to egocentrism, to the total destruction of social life. As in the case of freedom, so with the unique and hypostatic nature of the person, a relativization appears to be indispensable if chaos is to be avoided. Thus, uniqueness is relativized in social life, and man becomes, in a greater or lesser degree, but nevertheless assuredly so, a useful object, a combination, a persona. But it's precisely this which constitutes the tragic aspect of the person. Diffused today throughout all forms of social life is the intense search for personal identity. The person is not relativized without provoking a reaction. Man's inability to ensure his absolute identity in the world culminates in death. Death becomes tragic and unacceptable only when man is regarded as person, and above all as hypostasis and unique identity. As a biological event, death is something natural and welcome, because only in this way is life perpetuated. In the natural world, personal identity is ensured by childbearing, by the survival of the parents in the faces of their children. But this is not a survival of persons. It's a survival of the species, which may be observed equally in the whole animal kingdom and is directed by the harsh laws of natural selection. The survival of the person as a unique identity is not ensured by marriage and childbearing, which in the last analysis are shown only to supply matter for death. For if through all this being survives finally as the substance or as the species of a man, what does not survive is the concrete and unique identity, the person. The survival of the uniqueness, the hypostasis of a person, cannot be ensured by any property of the substance or nature. The attempt of ancient Greek philosophy, and also its influence on various forms of Christianity, to place the survival of man on a natural or substantial basis, such as the immortality of the soul, does not lead to a personal survival. If the soul is immortal by nature, then personal survival is necessary, and we return again to the ancient classical ontology. Even God is then immortal through his nature, that is, of necessity, and man is related substantially, necessarily, to God. All this, which was so natural for the ancient Greek, who had no full concept of the person, creates enormous existential problems when applied to the person in its Christian sense. For an inescapable immortality is not conceivable for the free God, and constitutes a challenge to the person. How then is the absolute and unique identity of the person ensured, seeing that the substance cannot do it? Humanistic existential philosophy tends to give the answer through an ontologizing of death, through an indissoluble union of being with non-being, of existence with death. This is not the place for a critique of this ontology. Such a philosophy is absolutely consequent upon itself because it refuses from the beginning, exactly like ancient philosophy, to discuss whether the hypothesis of an ontology outside this world is tenable. It's those theologians who accept this ontology of death while speaking at the same time about God that are inconsistent. For God constitutes the affirmation of being as life, eternal life, and is not God of the dead, but of the living, according to Matthew 22:32. And this means that theology, unlike philosophy, teaches an ontology which transcends the tragic aspect of death, without in the least accepting death as the ontological reality. Death being the last enemy of existence. 1 Corinthians 15:26. The survival of a personal identity is possible for God, not on account of his substance, but on account of his Trinitarian existence. If God the Father is immortal, it's because his unique and unrepeatable identity as Father is distinguished eternally from that of the Son and of the Spirit, who call him Father. If the Son is immortal, he owes this primarily not to his substance, but to his being the only begotten, Note here the concept of uniqueness, and his being the one in whom the Father is well pleased. Likewise, the Spirit is life-giving because he is communion. 2 Corinthians 13:14. The life of God is eternal because it is personal. That is to say, it's realized as an expression of free communion as love. Life and love are identified in the person. The person does not die only because it is loved and loves. Outside the communion of love, the person loses its uniqueness and becomes a being like other beings. A thing without absolute identity and name without a face. Death for a person means ceasing to love and to be loved, ceasing to be unique and unrepeatable, whereas life for the person means the survival of the uniqueness of its hypostasis, which is affirmed and maintained by love. I'm sorry for all of the errors for today. I'm going to keep going through. I am excited for you to hear this because it is just beautiful, and I look forward to hearing what you have to think.